YouTube or Zoom or all these worlds with the sound and technology. I was, of course, muted. Hi, everybody. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our Washington for Black Lives Town Hall. We have a really great program for you all this evening, talking about some really great stuff. And we're going to dive right into it. We'll start with introductions from our star-studded cast today. And so they will, say their names, pronouns, and what their organizations are, how they come to this work today. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to share with y'all today. So I will pass it to Jacqueline first.
Hello, everyone. My name's Jacqueline Harris, she, her pronouns. I'm a core member of Washington for Black Lives and the programs director for PAIRS, People Empowerment Renewal Services in Pierce County.
Thank you so much. And we'll pass it on to Dominique.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dominique Walker. I work with SDMC. Also, I use she, they pronouns.
Awesome. Thank you. And Nare?
Hi everyone, I'm Nare. I'm with the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, and I am an advocacy organizer.
Awesome. Thank you. And I am Sam Martin, advocate for Washington for Black Lives, as well as head of SDMC. So thank you again. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we have planned for you all this evening, what we're going to talk a little bit about. We have a really great agenda today and are going to be presenting on some really great stuff going on in our communities. First things first, we're going to talk a little bit about redistricting, which is a lot right now. But we'll talk a little bit about that, give some updates on that. Washington for Black Lives has done some really great work in that, some work in that space, and would love for our communities to get an update on that. We'll talk about some of our policy priorities for this upcoming year and some of the work that we hope to be doing in the policy space. And just talk about some ways to get involved and to get into the work. And so, again, we're hoping to be able to get y'all some good information and let y'all get to dinner and family time and stuff like that as well, too. So thank you again so much for being able to join us this evening. And we'll pass it on to Nare to talk a little bit about redistricting.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Like you said, there's a lot going on with redistricting this year, so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. And I'll go in chronological order, starting with the census. So a lot of our focus last year, especially at the Urban League with the Make Black Count campaign, was to ensure that every person of color was counted in the 2020 census. And that's because historically, our country has been prone to overcount white, non-Hispanic residents and undercount other racial and ethnic groups, resulting in underserved communities of color. And so we all know that the census is our once a decade opportunity to increase voting power, representation, and funding for these underserved BIPOC communities. And we also know that as a democracy, the country is responsible for ensuring that one person's voting power is just as equivalent as another person's voting power. And that we all have access to fair representation in the area that we reside in. So our Constitution demands that every 10 years, a census is taken to keep track of the population changes over time, and that the population areas are equally divided into voting districts. And these voting districts are also adjusted over time with the new population changes, which is otherwise known as redistricting. So last year's census results were pretty delayed, of course, due to COVID, just like everything else. And they were released in August, which pushed the timeline for drawing new districts, but we'll get a little bit to that later. So our 2020 census revealed that although we still have 10 seats in Congress, our state has grown by about 14.6%, which is about 1 million more residents than a decade ago. And we also found that our state is now roughly 35% people of color. And that is actually where equitable redistricting and reapportionment comes in. So for those who don't know, redistricting is the process of readjusting the districts over time using demographics and population information to ensure that voting power and representation is equally distributed in our legislative chambers. And so although BIPOC residents make up more than 1/3 of our state, we also see that that's not accurately reflected when you look at who's representing these communities. So our goal with the census results this year is to push our state's districting commission to draw districts that can increase BIPOC representation and voting power. So that's where redistricting comes in. So the Urban League is actually part of the Redistricting Justice for Washington Coalition, which has a lot of advocacy with the districting commission to ensure that our communities of color are kept together in the same district, because districts do determine who you vote for and how powerful your vote is. So our state's districting commission is very different than a lot of states in the country. We actually are, I think, one of 7 states to have a districting commission, which is a pretty big deal. So our state has a bipartisan districting commission, which is made up of 2 Democrat members, Brady Walkinshaw and April Sims, 2 Republican members, Joe Fain and Paul Graves, and a nonpartisan, non-voting chair, Sarah Augustine. And this commission was responsible for using the new census data and, of course, public input to draw our new maps for the next decade. Over time, can everybody hear me okay? Cool. So over time, the commission members would release proposal maps, and what we found is that they would keep prominent communities of color such as Southeast Seattle and Chinatown and International District outside of our 9th Congressional District, which is a majority BIPOC district, which is something that RJW, Redistricting Justice for Washington, is really against. And then they would also move these communities into a majority white suburban district. And so we were pushing back against that because that would only further suppress our voting power and representation for the next decade. However, unfortunately, after months of advocating for majority minority districts, the commission unfortunately was not able to meet the deadline to finalize these maps. And now the task is the Supreme Court, which is pretty new to me and I'm sure the rest of us. It's actually the first time in our state's history. And so what I can say is that although the commission released a statement that they would push the Supreme Court to consider their proposal maps, the Supreme Court they're not subject to the same rules and laws as the commission is. And we also don't know how much the public can be involved with the redistricting process with the Supreme Court this year. But we do know that the new deadline is April 30th, 2022, which will be in effect for the next election. So yeah, that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. If you look up Redistricting Justice for Washington online, there's a lot of great resources and information to follow along with the redistricting process and ways to be involved.
Thank you so much, and such great information. And again, I think you really hit the nail on the head with why it's so important for our communities to really engage in that work, right? And how it really is important for our representation in all elections. And yeah, we just got to continue to keep pushing forward to make sure that we're adequately represented. Thank you again. And so we'll pivot a little bit into our next piece. We're going to talk a little bit about some of our policy priorities and our recent policy pledge that we were able to produce as a coalition. I'll talk a little bit about what our policy pledge is and kind of why we or what we hope to do with it. There are kind of 3 key areas of our policy pledge. There's police accountability and transparency. There's investment in Black and Brown communities, and there's climate justice. Our intention and hope is to get lawmakers and community members and organizations to sign on to this policy pledge, one, in an effort and solidarity to improve our communities, but just recognizing that there's lots of key critical areas that really need that need our focus. we're going to have some of our coalition members talk a little bit about what those priorities are today. But again, we would love community support to be able to sign on to these to this policy pledge. And again, really any other ways that you can uplift it in your communities, to your local lawmakers and things like that. We'd absolutely love that support. And I will pass it on to Jacqueline Harris to talk a little bit about our first priority, which is police accountability and transparency.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. There are a few points, things that we want to make sure gets the attention of legislators. And listed on there is one of the bills, the House Bill 1203, that we actively worked towards getting, but didn't quite make it through the session, working towards ways to present that to the legislator. Even looking at some other avenues, being able to have other plans that we can enact within our communities, as well as garner community support to let the legislator know how important it is that we hold our law enforcement officers accountable for their acts, especially when they're acts against those that they're sworn to protect and serve, and empowering community members to be able to hold the law enforcement community accountable. And with those community oversight boards, it's helpful. There are pilot programs, similar programs within the state and even in Oregon. And so using those as case studies to be able to present and be able to show that, yes, this will work. This has to work because what we're doing now isn't working. Also, in under our policy priority, using other programs, for example, with parking enforcement, as well as transitioning that from being law enforcement, but to unarmed civil servants, issuing parking tickets or certain traffic stops. And there are programs that, as I mentioned before, pilot programs across the country that are working, for example, with this in Berkeley. And then in Denver, there are diversion programs that are in place to help with crime responses so that it's not, 12 police cars showing up at your house for a 911 call, as well as the diversion of some 911 calls those that don't require an armed response. And so being able to have mental health professionals or others that will be more equipped, depending on the circumstance, where it's not a life or death, not life-threatening, where they need an armed response. And so being able to get support and being able to highlight those programs that are working so that we can, get 1203 through the legislature this session.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So important. And I think everyone who's watching tonight recognizes the importance of continued accountability and transparency, and really uplifting and highlighting alternatives to the norm and the traditional, recognizing and knowing that, like you said, there doesn't necessarily need to be an armed response to things that are not life-threatening. So continuing to be able to push that work forward is really critical. And I'm so glad that we're continuing to do that as a coalition. And just before we transition to the next piece, wanting to just let everyone know who's watching that you have the opportunity to ask questions in the chat, and we will have an opportunity to be able to answer those questions once we're done presenting. So please feel free to throw those questions out there. We're going to transition to the next piece, which I will be covering, which is around the investment in Black and Brown communities. We know that there is a huge disproportionality in the lowest income earners paying the highest percentage of their wages in taxes, right? The lowest earners pay up to 18% of their income in taxes, various taxes in our state, which is completely regressive and really the most backwards tax code in the country. And so with continued work with our community partners, we really hope to move forward some ways that truly invest in Black and Brown communities. And so that comes from a couple of different ways, which is the wealth tax, which we were able to pass last year. But there's a couple of other things that we hope to be able to move forward, even this upcoming session, really recognizing things like the anti-displacement property tax, renters credits, which are not necessarily taxes on extremely high earners, but are also tax benefits or tax cuts to those who absolutely need it the most, right? We see that oftentimes high earners are the ones who get the tax cuts, but not the folks who need it the most. And so we really are working with our community partners to take a multi-tiered approach to what progressive revenue looks like. And so that a part of that does include taxing the extremely high earners, their appropriate and fair share, right? But then also making sure that we ease some of the burden on those who are some of the lower earners. And so we want to make sure that we give people an opportunity for economic mobility. And even when we talk about taxing high income earners, we're really intentional about making sure that that money gets funneled back into our communities. Oftentimes, we're the ones who are left out in these conversations, are not included in where the money goes and things like that. So we're really, really wanting to make sure that these resources go to the places that they need to be the most. So again, we're really excited to be able to continue to do this work with our community partners and really just, get that tax code flipped back on the right side. As we continue to transition to our next piece of the policy pledge and our policy priorities, I'm going to pass it on to Dominique Walker to talk a little bit about our climate justice section. The floor is yours, Dominique.
Hi, sorry, I'm just waiting for, okay, thank you. Okay, so climate justice having to do with combating climate change and that sort of thing, especially as it pertains to Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, and linguistically isolated communities. The impacts of climate change are more severely felt in those areas because they tend to be where there is industrial areas nearby or within those communities. There's also densely populated areas with less trees, less likely to have large public spaces with grass and green areas and that sort of thing as well. So some of the priorities that Washington for Black Lives is wanting to support or begin legislation on is things such as supporting investments in transit and multimodal transportation, including possibly incentivizing people to want to use public transit to commute or any way to try to incentivize people to drive less and that sort of thing. Also prioritizing implementing green and eco-friendly practices, especially in those low-income communities, finding ways to help people have access to eco-friendly or green changes that they can implement in their homes and in their communities as well, and producing a lasting cooling effect for Black and Brown communities through canopying public spaces, so planting trees and incentivizing people to want to do that in their public and private areas as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dominique. So again, this is just a little bit of a brief overview of the focus of the policy pledge. This is really one piece of the work that Washington for Black Lives is doing, but we're really hopeful that we can get some local lawmakers to sign on to this discussion or to sign on to this policy pledge and join the discussion around how we continue to improve our communities. We're really, really interested in the well-being of all Washingtonians and making sure that all Black and Brown folks across the state really have their needs met and have the opportunities that oftentimes historically haven't been granted to them. And again, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. And I think we do have one in the chat. And it comes from Charles Mayer. Any discussion at WA for Black Lives about state-based or other reparations? And that is a great, great question, Charles. Directly, we haven't had a lot of conversations about reparations, but I really do like and appreciate the question. I do think that that's something that we hope to be able to have the conversation about really soon. One of the things about the conversation around investment and, financial, capabilities is that it's a really hard conversation to have, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having it. And so I really do hope that as a coalition and as a group, we can continue to push the envelope and maybe have some of those harder conversations and push our state to be, to truly invest in Black and Brown communities. And does anyone else on our panel have any thoughts?
Just piggybacking off of you, Sam, just the fact that with our focus on the reinvestment in the communities, especially with the work with the tax code, fixing that and making sure that that gets in there is part of that process, being able to do that. And so definitely one of our core values, looking forward to seeing some changes come down the pipe, working towards that, and looking forward to community involvement, whether it's, excuse me, whether it is testifying, whether virtually or by email or letter, joining some of the public forums, especially with the town hall. And when we have town halls, being able to share that within your social media channels and, getting the community involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, please feel free to throw any continued questions in the chat. We'll have an opportunity to answer any questions that may arise. And again, if you have or are interested in signing on to our policy pledge, we're about to transition into that space next and talk a little bit about that. But do we have another question? Are there any further actions or ways to participate in the redistricting process now that it's in the courts? And I will pass it to Naira. I think you can probably answer that a little bit.
Yeah. As of right now, this is uncharted territory for everybody. So I do not have a definite way to participate, but I do think staying updated by Redistricting Justice for Washington, they're pretty good at updating people on how to stay involved. But again, this is the first time in history that the Supreme Court has been tasked with doing this. So as of right now, I'm not sure.
No, that's all right. And yeah, please sign up at redistrictingjustice.org and we'll continue to get that information out as it arises, right? This, as Naira just said, we are in new territory. So being able to roll with the punches and be adaptable during this process is critical. Thank you for that question, Emily. Awesome. Well, okay, so we can transition into some other ways to continue to get involved. And there's really a few different ways to be able to get involved in our work. We are always looking for opportunities for folks to be able to donate to our coalition and to help us and to help fund the work. That's really important. And frankly, hasn't historically always been provided to coalitions of color, right? And so we need community support to be able to continue to do this work and continue to push it forward. So any support that you can provide will absolutely be met with a ton of gratitude. Subscribe to the Tally. We'll throw these links in the chat as well too, to be able to continue to get more information about the work that Washington Community Alliance is doing. And also signing on to our policy pledge or signing up to be able to get more information about the policy pledge. We'll have that link in the chat as well too. And again, whatever ways that you all feel so compelled to get involved and to join the work, please absolutely do so. And just to uplift some of the things that we hope to do as we go into 2022, as we talked about today, our policy pledge is one of the kind of key areas that we're hoping to ramp up and get some support from local lawmakers, state lawmakers, and frankly, there's, even elections for some federal lawmakers as well too from our state. And so we want to continue to see our lawmakers sign on to the things that we know is important to our communities. So that's going to be a big push that we'll make this next year. We're also gearing up for the state legislative session, and we'll have a legislative agenda to be able to drop and to share with folks at the beginning of December once our coalition finalizes our vote on it in the coming week and a half here. And also, we're really gearing up to be able to start up a work group or a kind of subgroup that focuses on being able to work with local governments to find alternatives and implement alternatives to policing. We're really excited about this work and standing up this work because we know that there's some interest across our state to really, really try out some new things. It's similar to what Jacqueline talked about a little bit earlier, making sure that we have different responses and putting in resources to different ways to make sure that our communities are safe. And so we got a lot of things on the horizon, and we'll continue to reach out to the community, and we'll continue to share this information with everyone as much as we possibly can. So thank you again for your continued support. Thank you again for everything that you all do. We really couldn't do it without you. And so let's continue to make our communities better. Let's continue to fight the good fight. And as the late John Lewis would say, let's make some good trouble, y'all. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful night. Enjoy y'all's dinner.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.